There is a harbor on the island of Malta where the water runs so deep and so blue that, standing at its edge in the summer heat, you understand immediately, with the specific bodily intelligence that precedes conscious thought, why every empire that ever controlled the Mediterranean wanted this rock, this 8-mile strip of limestone barely rising from the sea between Sicily and the North African coast, because whoever holds Malta holds the throat of the Mediterranean, controls the passage between its eastern and western halves, commands the shipping lanes that carried the wealth of 3 continents, and in the spring of 1565, the most powerful empire on earth understood this with a clarity that produced the largest Ottoman amphibious operation since the assault on Rhodes 40 years earlier, an invasion force that the sources place at somewhere between 30 and 40,000 soldiers and sailors carried in nearly 200 ships under the command of the veteran admiral PLA Pasha and the aged but ferocious land commander Mustafa Pasha. And what stood against this force on that limestone rock was so numerically absurd that when the numbers are stated plainly, they sound like a clerical error. Approximately 540 Knights of the Order of St. John, supported by perhaps 6,000 to 9,000 Maltese militia and Spanish soldiers, commanded by a 70-year-old Frenchman named Jean Parisot de Valette, who had himself spent a year as an Ottoman galley slave, and who looked at the fleet filling his harbor and did not flinch, and the question scorched into that limestone by 4 months of the most savage siege warfare of the 16th century. Produced is not whether the knights could rationally have expected to survive. The mathematics said they could not. The question is what it cost every human being on both sides to discover that mathematics is not always the last word. The Knights Hospitaller who held Malta in 1565 were not the idealized warrior monks of popular imagination, but the last institutional remnant of the crusading movement, an organization that had spent 4 centuries evolving from a Jerusalem hospital into a sovereign military order that had been expelled from the Holy Land, then from Cyprus, then from Rhodes in 1522, after a 6-month siege by Suleiman the Magnificent, who had allowed them to depart with honors in a gesture of magnanimity that his successors would not repeat. And the knights had spent 7 uncomfortable years as guests of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, before he gave them Malta in 1530 as a feudal holding at the symbolic rent of 1 falcon per year, a gift so strategically brilliant from Charles Bacque's perspective, and so strategically exposed from the knight's perspective that Valette had spent the 35 years since working to fortify an island that geology had not designed for defense, building the fortress of St. Elmo at the tip of the peninsula guarding the harbor mouth, expanding the fortifications of Birgu and Senglea on the 2 promontories flanking the Grand Harbor, and requisitioning every cannon, every powder barrel, every measure of grain that the order's considerable financial resources could source. And the Ottoman decision to move against Malta in 1565 was not impulsive. It was the strategic conclusion of an empire that had watched the Knights use Malta as a base for raiding Ottoman shipping and Ottoman coastal settlements for 3 decades, and that had calculated correctly by every conventional military metric that the island could be taken in weeks. Mustafa Pasha made the decision that defined the entire siege before the first shot was fired. He decided to take the small fort of St. Elmo first to secure the harbor mouth, before turning to the main hospitaller positions at Birgu and Senglea, and his engineers told him St. Elmo would fall in days, perhaps a week. And what happened instead across the following 31 days is one of the most statistically improbable defensive performances in the history of siege warfare, because the garrison of St. Elmo, reinforced by volunteers who crossed the harbor by night in small boats, knowing they were rowing toward their deaths, held the fort for a month against the full weight of Ottoman assault. And Mustafa Pasha watched his casualty figures climb past 4,000 dead, 8,000 dead, attacking a position held by perhaps 1,500 men. And every day St. Elmo held was a day the relief army from Sicily did not come, and a day Valette used to strengthen Birgu and Senglea. And when St. Elmo finally fell on June 23rd, and Mustafa looked at the ruins and calculated what it had cost him, he is reported to have said that if the son had cost so much, what would the father cost? And the answer to that question, delivered across the next 3 months of assault against Birgu and Senglea, was everything the Ottoman expedition had, and more than it could replace. The uncomfortable reality of the Great Siege that the triumphalist hospitaller tradition has never fully absorbed is that the defense of Malta was not conducted by 500 pure-hearted warrior monks protecting civilization against barbarism. It was conducted by a military organization with its own long and morally complex history of violence, piracy, and institutional ruthlessness, because the Knights' operations from Malta before the siege included the seizure of Muslim merchant vessels that were not military targets, the enslavement of Muslim sailors and coastal populations in raids that were functionally indistinguishable from the Ottoman raiding they condemned, and the Maltese population who provided the labor and the blood, and the militia fighters without whom the defense was simply impossible, had no meaningful voice in the political decisions of an order that ruled them as subjects rather than citizens, and within the Ottoman force itself, the picture is equally complex. The Janissaries, who threw themselves at the walls of St. Elmo and Birgu, were soldiers of extraordinary discipline and courage, operating within a military tradition of genuine sophistication, and Dragut Reis, the Corsair admiral whose tactical counsel was considered essential to the operation and who died at St. Elmo from a cannonball fragment on June 18th, was, by any objective measure, one of the most gifted naval commanders of the 16th century. A man whom even his Christian enemies described with undisguised professional admiration, and the siege, as ferocity, was not the ferocity of civilization against barbarism, but the ferocity of two heavily armed institutional systems, colliding over a piece of limestone neither of them had any organic connection to. The relief force from Sicily arrived on September 7, 1565, and the Ottoman army, ravaged by casualties and disease and the accumulated exhaustion of 4 months of failed assault, withdrew. And the Mediterranean erupted in celebrations that contemporaries compared to the response to Lepanto 6 years later, and Valette became the most famous Christian commander alive, and the new city built on the peninsula across the harbor from Birgu was named Valletta after him, and is today the capital of the Republic of Malta. And the siege entered the mythology of European resistance to Ottoman expansion as one of its defining moments, and that mythology is not wrong about the physical courage it celebrates. What happened on that limestone rock between May and September 1565 was a genuine act of collective human endurance that deserves the astonishment it has always generated. But mythology has a function, and the function is never purely commemorative. It is always also political. And the political function of the Great Siege mythology was to provide the Order of St. John with a founding narrative for its continued existence at a moment when the original justification for crusading military orders had been visibly exhausted for 2 centuries. And today the island of Malta is a small European republic, whose fortress walls and Baroque churches and harbor fortifications constitute one of the densest concentrations of 16th century military architecture anywhere on Earth. And tourists photograph those walls without knowing that they were built on the calculus of acceptable losses and institutional survival. And the limestone is silent about what it witnessed, and the question it has been holding in its ancient geology since the summer of 1565 is the question that every celebrated last stand eventually forces upon the people who inherit its legend, which is this: when we call a defense heroic, are we honoring the people who bled on those walls, or are we honoring the institution that spent them? And do we actually know the difference? And does it matter that we cannot always tell?